I want to start by correcting the record on something because a lot of people claim that the Republicans, the conservatives, people over there on the right, that they do not politicize and don't like to politicize gun violence. That is absolutely false. And the reason that it's important to me to correct that misconception is because the people who make those kinds of claims are people on the right. Every time there is a mass shooting in the United States, particularly a school shooting that involves very young people, children and teenagers, and we're talking about every day at the current pace, or if we limit our attention to just the ones that are bad enough, horrific enough, bloody enough to get nationwide news coverage, maybe every few days. But every time such an event happens, as it did in Winder, Georgia at Appalachia High School last week, Democrats, liberals, leftists, progressives will make our best effort at using that tragedy to get people's attention and to say, hey, this sort of thing happens here all the time and it doesn't have to be this way. It's not this way in other countries. We can do something to fix this problem. And the comeback to that from the right is invariably, how dare you try to politicize this tragedy? Let these families mourn. Let these people bury their dead. They've lost loved ones. They've lost children. You monster, you callous monster, trying to use the tragedy of these poor people to get your political agenda, your anti-freedom political agenda across. You should be ashamed of yourself. We Republicans, we conservatives, we don't politicize gun violence. That's not true. They do. They politicize gun violence. They politicize mass shootings. They politicize school shootings all the time. They just don't do it to try to get anything good done. They don't do it to try to engineer positive change. I'll give you a perfect example based on the school shooting I mentioned a minute ago that just happened last week in Winder, Georgia at Appalachia High School. And I'm basing my commentary here on reporting published by the invaluable website Right Wing Watch, and specifically an article by Kyle Mantila. The article reports on comments regarding the Appalachia High School shooting made by Gordon Klingenschmidt. And if you've never heard of Gordon Klingenschmidt before, count yourself lucky. What a charmed life that you have lived up until this moment. I'm sorry to ruin it for you. But Gordon Klingenschmidt is a far-right, anti-LGBTQ bigot, a religious zealot, a self-styled televangelist. He's a right-wing grifter and a right-wing asshole. And he talks about how we need to stop gay people from having equality and trans people from having equality, and that queer people, LGBTQ identified people are all the work of the devil. He's an asshole. He's a religious zealot, fanatical asshole. And he fits right in with the Republican Party and the Trump supporting side of our politics. And he had something to say about the Appalachia High School shooting, and specifically the identity, or what he claims to be the identity of the shooter. Again, from the article on Right Wing Watch, today Klingenschmidt sent out an email titled "School Shooter Wanted Transgenderism for Kids" to supporters of his Pray in Jesus' Name organization. And now, here's the article quoting from Klingenschmidt's email. The FBI had found evidence linked to the alleged Appalachia High School shooter that could explain his motivation, reports CNN. The alleged shooter is a boy who dresses and looks like a girl. The FBI report cited documents claiming that a Discord account was identified last year by the FBI as belonging to the Appalachia High School shooter. According to CNN's summary of the posts, the account owner said that he was planning an attack on an elementary school and expressed frustration with the lack of acceptance of transgender people. And then back to quoting Kyle Mantila's article on Right Wing Watch, Klingenschmidt concluded his email by declaring that, quote, LGBT recruiters are turning kids, quote, into stone-cold killers, and urged activists to sign a petition calling on Congress, quote, to protect kids from transgender recruiters. It will probably come as no surprise to most of you that Gordon Klingenschmidt is completely full of shit, and his arguments here are based on lies and distortions and willful misunderstandings and mischaracterizations of the one proper source that he cites in his email, which is an article from CNN. Now, in that CNN article, in an earlier version of it that was published on the CNN website, there was a reference about how the Appalachia high school shooter had made comments on some of his social media profiles about transgender people, and the earlier version of the article did say that the Appalachia school shooter had expressed his frustration with the acceptance of transgender people. Now, that is imprecise phrasing that you can take several ways. And of course, Gordon Klingenschmitt, in order to serve his radical, rabid, anti-trans, anti-queer right-wing narrative, he interpreted that to mean that the Appalachia school shooter was upset by the lack of acceptance of transgender people, and he was carrying out this crime to strike a blow in favor of trans acceptance and to strike out against people who didn't accept trans people, that either he himself is trans or he is fighting on behalf of trans people and he's carrying out this violent act in their name. That's how Gordon Klingenschmitt is framing it. But you'll notice that I said an earlier version of the CNN story. After they noticed that there was some confusion, CNN, to its credit, corrected and updated that story, and it now makes it clear that he was upset that they were being accepted, not that they weren't being accepted. He was mad at trans people and mad about trans people being accepted, not mad on their behalf and mad at people not accepting them. And this correction to the CNN article was made before Gordon Klingenschmitt sent out his email. He should have and could have known, and probably did know, to be completely honest, before he sent out his email saying, oh, it's the mass shooter of the Appalachia High School is a trans person, or he was fighting on behalf of trans people. Look what transgenderism is doing to our children. He knew, or should have known by the time he sent out that email, that he was wrong, that he was lying, that what he was saying about trans people and about the Appalachia school shooter was false. But he said what he said anyway, and of course he did, because for the last several years, since bigotry against trans people and fear-mongering about trans people has become such a staple of right-wing politics here in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and other places all over the world, but most virulently here and in the UK, right-wing politicians have been obsessed with painting trans people as dangerous, as predators, as violent. I've even seen claims by some right-wingers that most mass shooters or most school shooters are trans. Again, this will probably come as no surprise to most of you, but that is completely false. It's pretty much the other way around. I found a fact-check article from Reuters that details some of this. Fact check. Most mass school shootings are not carried out by transgender people. No kidding. Huh. I'll link the entire article in the video description, but here is the most pertinent section. Transgender individuals represent less than 1% of perpetrators in all mass shootings over the past decade, and about 2% involved in school shootings specifically, according to the Gun Violence Archive. So notice the facts don't say that trans people are perfect. There is, every once in a while, unfortunately, a mass shooter who does turn out to be trans. Like any other demographic of people, trans people include good people and bad people, people who do terrible things and people who would never think of doing such a terrible thing. But statistically speaking, trans people are far more likely to be victims of violent crime than they are to ever perpetrate violent crime. And these are just statistical facts that have been known and widely available for a very long time, and they are ignored by right-wingers like Gordon Klingenschmitt and Donald Trump, who has been peppering his stump speech lately with some really ugly, fear-mongering transphobia as well, because those facts don't fit their narrative, and that's what Republicans and right-wingers do when they encounter facts that don't fit their narrative. They just push them to the side. Trans people, including trans kids, trans teenagers, trans high school students, are not the threat that people like Donald Trump and Gordon Klingenschmitt make them out to be, as is almost always the case. This accusation by a right-winger is actually a confession. It is an act of projection. It is an attempt at deflection to distract us from the fact and keep us from noticing and talking about the fact that it's actually people like them who are responsible for most of these sorts of acts of violence and for inciting people to commit these sorts of acts of violence. They make it sound like it's us being violent against them, but actually it's them being violent against us and also being violent against each other. J.D. Vance is still out on the campaign trail giving stump speeches where he's saying, in reference to the shooting of Donald Trump, they tried to kill him. He says that repeatedly. He still says it to this day. They tried to kill him, even though we have known since a matter of days after the shooting that it was a registered Republican who took that shot at Trump. It wasn't some wild-eyed radical leftist. It wasn't some anarchist. It wasn't some trans person out to take revenge on Donald Trump on behalf of their group. It was a Republican. It was a right-winger. It was a conservative taking a shot at Trump. They took a shot at one of their own. We didn't try to kill him. They tried to kill him, but that doesn't matter. They ignore that fact. They ignore the facts about trans people and how they relate to violent crime. They ignore the fact that if there is a school shooting or a mass shooting, it is almost a statistical certainty that the perpetrator was not trans, was not gay, was probably not a woman, was almost definitely a cis hetero man. And if that cis hetero man who carried out the mass shooting or the school shooting exhibited any particular political philosophy or political view, again, statistically, it was probably on the right rather than the left. The claim is not that leftists are never violent or leftists never do anything bad. It's just that if there is a mass shooting in this country, odds are it was a right-leaning political person who did it, and they were not a queer-identifying person. They were a cis-het man. Those are the facts. Those are the opposite of the arguments that are being made by people like Gordon Klingenschmitt and Donald Trump and being made by many others on behalf of Donald Trump. The truth is, leftists, progressives, liberals, Democrats are not the threat. Republicans, conservatives, right-wingers are the threat. The threat is not trans people or queer people as an overall group or those of us who fight for their rights. The threat is people like Donald Trump and Gordon Klingenschmitt and all of their supporters and all of those people who fight for their own benefit, for their own power, to get what they want, and are willing to take away the rights of everybody else in order to get it.